So welcome to the International Dermal Institute Industry Expert Webinar. My name is Beth Bayalco. I am the Director of Education Development for Dermalogica and the International Dermal Institute. And I am beyond thrilled to have you join us for our very first Industry Expert Webinar series. And today is very special because we have an amazing guest who's joining us from the UK. And this is Candice Gardner, and she is our Education Manager for Digital and Content for the International Dermal Institute in Dermalogica for the UK and the Republic of Ireland. So Candice is responsible for development of educational content and management of our extensive postgraduate curriculum in that region. And she has over 25 years experience in the industry. And so a lot of you maybe have attended Candice's courses before, maybe you've seen her on different types of social media platforms, but she definitely has that amazing voice and presentation style where she is able to connect skin science and product technology with the practicalities of professional skincare. So Candice was actually trained in South Africa, so a little bit more information about her. And she also has definitely diplomas in CIBTAC and CDESCO. So her experience is amazing, and we are so excited to have her join us today. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about the International Dermal Institute, and then I'm going to give it right up to Candice so we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you who maybe are here for the very first time, the International Dermal Institute definitely postgraduate education and professional skincare all around the world. We were founded in 1983 by Jane Werwand, who is our founder and chief visionary when it comes to everything about education. And of course, in 1986, Dermalogica products followed. So the exciting thing about the International Dermal Institute right now is that we have done a lot of work digitally. So you're able to tune into things like this, Industry Expert Webinar Series. We've got courses online, but most importantly, you need to check out dermalinstitute.com and let it be a resource for you about everything when it comes to skincare, ingredients, protocols, and definitely techniques. So I know we're anxious to hear from Candice, so I'm going to hand it over to her to go ahead and get started all about exploring the epidermis.
Hello, 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 everybody. It's super exciting to be here. Thank you so much, Beth, for inviting me. I'm thrilled, and hello to everybody around the world. We're going to have a really great hour or so together, and I hope that at the end of this session, you're going to have a brand new, fresh enthusiasm for your epidermis, and you're also going to be excited about perhaps revisiting some of the strategies and thought processes that you have in your everyday recommendations around skincare, because the epidermis is our connection to the outside world, but it is like a protective shield. And so today we're going to be looking at not just some of the obvious stuff that we talk about in terms of the epidermal barrier. We will tie into what we already know, but we're going to focus on some of those less talked about areas and understand them in a little bit greater depth. So I want to kick off today to say it's cloudy in London today, and for those of you who are joining me from London and the UK, I'm sure that you will agree we've had actually some super brilliant weather. We may have thought we were in California or something a few weeks ago because the weather was absolutely glorious, but it's a little bit up and down at the moment. And it's the reason I raise the weather is because everybody in Britain talks about the weather because our weather is so shocking. But actually, the climate is really a very big part of what our skin is defending against. It's very relevant to how our skin behaves. And so part of our barrier shield really looks at how do we adjust when things in our environment adjust. So whether that's the humidity levels or whether that's the temperature, all of those things have an impact on how our skin and our epidermis behaves. But as a whole, our epidermis has the function of defending primarily against three key things: pathogens, which are microbes that have the potential to cause infection or disease or damage to the skin and potentially the body. We also need to absolutely defend against ultraviolet light, because ultraviolet light generates free radicals, and I'm sure in your skincare journey you've heard a lot about free radicals. They're sometimes also called reactive oxygen species, and these molecules actually disrupt the structure and behavior of your skin tissues and structures, and they cause damage to them. And the consequence of that is those tissues and structures deteriorate, and either they don't function effectively or correctly and therefore don't do what they're supposed to do, or they could potentially become so damaged and altered that they start to mutate, and then we see the development of skin cancers, etc. So ultraviolet light is a big aspect that we have to defend from. And then of course we need to protect from irritants, because there are all sorts of irritating particles that occur in our environment that we need to make sure that our skin can cope with. And in fact, we put a lot of things on our skin every day. If you think about what we do with skincare, that's a big thing, potential irritant for our skin if we don't make the right choices and the right selections. So part of what we're going to do today is try and understand a little bit more about what can happen with the skin when a few of these barrier functions are kicked out of sync, and why it's important for us to kind of keep bringing all of that function back in line using our skincare products and our skincare services. And in honesty, life is very, very different to what it was 100 years ago. So, you know, probably 100 years ago, you weren't anywhere near as exposed to the pollution. The food you were eating was much better. You probably didn't have the great degree of stress. It doesn't mean stress didn't exist, but it wasn't at the same pace that we're living today. So the consequences of the impact to your skin are quite different to how things are for us today. And so we need to make adjustments for that as well. And that's part and parcel of why skincare is changing and evolving all the time, because not only are we learning new things about the skin, but we're also starting to understand how different aspects of our environment impact that skin behavior, and then what we can do to support our skin and help that skin to have the best defense possible. So the skin is all about barrier formation, and I'm pretty sure that you will have seen slides like this before, and you would have talked about this barrier very many times before. And if you look at what we've got here, this is all about that epidermal structure, and the epidermal structure is the first top layer of our skin, which is directly exposed to the external environment. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So I don't want to say that the dermis is not important. It is. It does have lots of various functions. But rather than focus on that connective tissue in the dermis today, we're going to be zoning in on the epithelial tissue and what happens as we produce those basal cells, and as that moves up through the different layers of the epidermis, and those cells change shape, change structure, and change function in order to create that barrier. But we're also going to look at some of the other factors around this. So we're going to talk corneocytes, yes. We are going to talk a little bit about natural moisturizing factors and lipids. And we're going to talk about barrier function as a whole. But I want to move you on to looking at barrier function slightly differently from what you might be accustomed to in terms of this sort of singular focus of the skin barriers formation. I want you to take a look at this diagram here. And I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds to look at the diagram and process all of the different barriers that impact or contribute to your skin's natural barrier. So I think as we go through this, you will recognize all of these barriers. So let's clarify what they are. So the microbiome barrier, we've been talking a lot about the microbiome in recent times. There's a lot of industry conversation about the microbiome barrier. And the microbiome barrier is really all of that, those microbes and that unique ecosystem that lives on the surface of the skin. And the microbiome barrier actually creates a barrier by taking up space and by taking up nutrients. So in other words, certain types of microbes and bacteria have what we call a commensal relationship on the skin. So they benefit from us as humans and from the structure of our skin, but equally we benefit because those positive bacteria actually restrict the growth of negative bacteria that we don't want to get out of control. So those particular microbes, the ones we're most probably interested in is our epidermidis, our stratum epidermidis, Staphylococcus epidermidis bacteria, because that particular bacteria really helps to stabilize the skin, and it helps to stabilize pH, and it also helps to influence the buildup of antimicrobial peptides in the skin, which we'll talk about in a second as well. So the microbiome barrier is an important part of our skin barrier, but you will see that it occurs really at the surface of the skin, and it interacts with the stratum corneum. So the stratum corneum barrier, which is the second barrier that we have here, the stratum corneum barrier is very specific because its job is really to help control what's entering the skin, and it works in combination with the microbiome barrier. So we talk a lot in skincare about balancing the skin, and that a healthy skin has a good balance of lipids and water and a healthy microbiome. And those are the three things that really impact whether your skin looks good and healthy from the outside. Now, the stratum corneum barrier, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the influence of those stratum corneum lipids and the influence of some of the other processes that happen in the skin on those stratum corneum lipids, as well as the natural moisturizing factors that occur in the stratum corneum cells. So inside the corneocytes, we have a very high density of natural moisturizing factors. And the job of those natural moisturizing factors is to basically attract moisture from the atmosphere so that your skin, even when there is a relatively low humidity, it can still have the capacity to pull moisture from the skin, from the atmosphere, in order that your skin function can be effective, because you need hydration in the skin to be effective. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today. Then we've got something here called the tight junction barrier. So we're going to clarify a little bit more about the tight junction barrier. This barrier actually occurs at the granulosum layer. So we're going to dig down a little bit in a second about what happens in the tight junction barrier, because that is almost the ceiling point. So this is a point at which really your skin is pretty impermeable. So I know when we're doing electrical treatments and equipment, using electrical equipment, we do that to be able to push product past the tight junction barrier, because what we do with electrical equipment and machines is we create changes in polarity, and those polar aspects help us to drive ingredients through the tight junction barrier, which normally wouldn't be able to get across there. Then we've got what we call our chemical barrier down here. And the chemical barrier is really the barrier that exists through the production of antimicrobial peptides. So peptides are sort of protein fragments, but they are really important in helping to control and regulate the microbial activity that could potentially occur in the skin. Now, you'll notice that actually the tight junction barrier, it's really important that you have a tight junction barrier to separate the microbiome barrier from the internal environment of the skin, because obviously we don't want the microbes to get deeper down into the skin. They help and they contribute at the stratum corneum level. They're really important at the stratum corneum level in helping us to regulate certain function. But actually, we don't want microbes getting into the rest of the skin or deeper down into the skin, because then they would be considered pathogens and there is a potential for them to cause problems and infection. So the tight junction barrier keeps the microbiome up and out, and the chemical barrier is a secondary sort of barrier to that. It helps. So that chemical barrier, as I said, is made up of antimicrobial peptides, and those are produced by predominantly by your keratinocyte cells, but you can have antimicrobial peptides also being produced by the microbiome barrier. So interestingly, there is a connection through the skin that we help to control and regulate what's happening with those microbes. And then, of course, down here and deeper down in the skin, which really occurs sort of at the dermal level and up at the basement junction, you have your immunological barrier, and this sort of extends up towards the granulosum layer. So the immunological barrier are all those white blood cells that contribute to macrophages, Langerhans cells that contribute to helping get rid of invaders that might be making their way into the skin. So we've got quite a lot going on here in the skin, and I think sometimes when we talk about the skin barrier, we really only reference in terms of that singular barrier of the keratinocyte cells and what's happening at the corneum level with protection between the corneocytes and the lipid barrier, and that sort of shield to things getting in and moisture getting out. But actually the epidermis has a whole bunch of barriers which ensure that we are sort of they're reinforcing each other, so that if something does get past the barrier, does happen to breach a certain barrier, you've got another type of barrier as you work your way down into the skin. So the implications are that actually a lot of the time skincare products tend to have a lot of impact in the stratum corneum barrier area. And once you want to get past the tight junction barrier, you have to think about how you're going to get those ingredients past that tight junction barrier, which is why you need to also have ingredients that have carrier molecules. So in the instance of peptides, often palmitic acid is used, or you have to polarize the molecules in a certain way so that they can penetrate past that barrier. So there's ways that we have to modify skincare products in order to get them past the tight junction barrier, but it doesn't mean we can't get them past. We can, and it just also depends on their solubility. So a lot of the time, solubility also has an impact, because if you are a water-soluble ingredient, you're going to struggle to get past the tight junction barrier. So let's click forward and talk a little bit more about tight junctions. Oh, maybe I should erase my little arrows. That will look a bit better. So let's talk a little bit about the different junctions between the cells, because I think we talk quite a lot about the fact that the cells in the epidermis are constantly renewing and replacing this sort of cell layers, are moving up to the surface, and then we're getting desquamation at the surface of the skin. But I wonder if you've ever thought about how this dynamic epithelial tissue is moving and shifting and changing all the time, but somehow it still stays intact, and somehow it still maintains that reinforced barrier. And that was something that really I thought a lot about. You know, how is it that the cells are migrating upwards they're changing shape, they're changing structure, they're changing behavior, they're getting to the surface, they're falling off, but it's somehow, even though they're moving through those layers, they're staying together and they're still creating all that security and protection and shielding action. So let's talk a little bit about these different cell junctions and the differences between them. So tight junctions we were mentioning were really important in that tight junction barrier layer. And actually the tight junctions are sometimes called occluding junctions. So their job is to create that very, very tight seal from anything coming in. Because what we don't want is, we don't want, you know, if you've got in the bath, we don't want you to suddenly blow up because water would just flood into your body. But equally, we don't want you to completely and utterly dehydrate or get infection or pathogens into the body. So the tight junction is really that seal point. Now, there are other junctions as well. And we talk a lot about desmosomes. And desmosomes are really the junctions that seal the cells to each other, or connect, should I say, the cells to each other. Adherence junctions also are connectors. Desmosomes tend to give strength, so they make sure that the integrity of the epidermis is maintained. Adherence junctions also help with that integrity, but they give a bit more flexibility and movement. They allow for the fact that the skin is moving, and it means that it's not entirely rigid. So it's not, the cells are not kind of coming up in one fixed layer, and it's also not as a hard structure. Then you've got our gap junctions, and the gap junctions are just points at which the cells can pass different water-soluble ingredients to each other. And that becomes important because certain ingredients or certain compounds in the skin help to elevate the pH or help to control some of the differentiation actions or the different keratinization actions in the skin. So there are moments where we have to increase acidification in the skin. There's moments where we have to regulate the calcium levels in the skin. And we're going to come on to talk a little bit more about our calcium gradient and our pH a little bit later. But those gap junctions allow the movement of solutes in and out of the cells, between the cells, and also into that intercellular space. And then, of course, we've got what we are really the basement junctions. Hemidesmosomes is one of those basement junctions, and that allows epithelial tissue, which is the type of tissue in your epidermis, to be adhered or connected to the dermal tissue and actually to that matrix of a connective tissue. So there are other types of basement membranes, but hemidesmosomes, you know, I popped up there because I think those are the ones that you're probably most familiar with hearing about. So just to sort of give you a comparison, a tight junction is a bit like a Ziploc bag. So if you have a tight junction, literally it's a seal, zipping it locked. Whereas a desmosome or an adherence junction, they tend to be, the cadherins are the sort of compounds that attach the desmosomes together, and those are calcium dependent, but it's almost a bit more like Velcro. So the Velcro, if you've got kind of a lot of surface area on a Velcro, it can be quite difficult to pull apart. And really, that's exactly what the desmosomes and adherent junctions are a little bit like. So to kind of give you a bit of a comparison between the difference of a tight junction and a desmosome junction in the skin. So you can pull those desmosomes apart, and we usually do that by chelating something like calcium, so that we reduce the amount of calcium load in the skin, and then those cadherins will weaken and the cells will separate. And that is something that contributes to the change in what happens as we go up through the skin and to the corneum where those cells are going to be shed. So if we take ourselves back to our stratum germinativum, we're very familiar with these basement cells that rise up through the layers of the epidermis. But I think as we rise up, you know, through the epidermis, we're going to start to see changes to what is occurring in the different cell layers. But before we get to that, what I thought was probably quite important is to say that in amongst these cells, so yes, they're going to change shape, but we also have melanocytes. And because the epidermis is responsible for defending against our external environment, the melanocyte response is really important. And our skin effectively has two ways of protecting against ultraviolet light. One is to thicken the epidermis, so you actually get a build-up actually of the stratum corneum. So the corneum actually thickens so that it creates a deeper set of cells that can sort of disperse or filter that UV light and make it more difficult for the UV light to get down to the cells that have nucleus and are active and living. But we also have melanin response. Now, what's interesting about the melanin response is that irrespective of your ethnicity, your skin tone, your skin color, we all have roughly the same number of melanocytes. And, you know, whether you're looking at anybody's melanocyte distribution across any skin tone or type, you will see that pretty much roughly the number of melanocytes and how many skin cells they provide melanin for is about the same. But what is different is the type of melanin they produce, the concentration of melanin that they produce, and how that melanin is distributed through the skin. So what happens when you are exposed to light? Well, actually, light can change the pigment in your skin. And lots of people sort of think initially that it's all about melanin production. But actually, it depends on how much how much UV exposure you're getting as to what happens to the melanin in your skin. So the first thing that happens is actually we get what we call immediate pigment darkening. And usually that happens literally with UVA. So even on a cloudy day, if you are out and it's a cloudy day, you can still get some levels of immediate pigment darkening. And actually the skin can go almost like a little bit of a grayish color. And you might have seen that. A little bit of a grayish color, and then it starts to turn a little bit darker and fades to a brown color over a period of, you know, a few minutes to a few days, depending on your skin. Now, that immediate pigment darkening doesn't really give you any UV protection, but it is an oxidizing process that happens with the pigment that's already existing in your skin. Then your skin kicks in, so perhaps if you're getting a little bit more exposure and there is a bigger dose of UVA, then you will also get a bit more pigment darkening and oxidation, which is quite similar, but this usually occurs after an hour of exposure. So if you are outdoors longer, you will get persistent pigment darkening now kicking in, and that darkening can happen over a 2 to 3 day period post the sun exposure. And again, this is all about the oxidation of the pigment that's existing in your skin. Now, the final type of response is something called delayed tanning, and delayed tanning kicks in when your skin is exposed to UVA and UVB. And the delayed tanning process is actually where we are getting production of new melanin in the skin. and we're accelerating the melanin production, the concentration of it, and also we could find that our skin is getting more dendritic. Those cells are producing, those melanocyte cells are producing more dendrites or arms to distribute that higher concentration of melanin. So I think what's important to say in all of this is that, you know, lots of people believe that they can pre-tan their skins and they can get a good amount of protection from pre-tanning. But even a delayed tan gives you virtually, you know, minimal protection, because a delayed tan only offers you around an SPF of 3. So if you think that good sun protection should be an SPF 15 and plus, delayed tanning isn't enough, or the delayed tanning process isn't enough in order to get your skin prepared. And if you've got lots of clients who are sunbed junkies and they're using you know, sunbeds with UVA based exposure, they are potentially getting immediate and persistent pigment darkening, but they're oxidizing existing melanin, and actually they're not getting much level of protection or shielding from that at all. So melanin in the base is produced down there in the basement layer, or our stratum granulosum, but it's having an effect all the way through the epidermis and all the way to the surface of the skin. So as we move up through the layers, we then find the stratum spinosum, and this is the point at which our skin is starting to prepare for the keratinization process. And so this is the area that we're going to see that the cells are starting to change shape, but they're also making sure that they can start to connect with each other. So these spiny projections make sure that we're getting those cell connections, and communication is really good through the cell layers, so that as we move up into these other processes, the cells can keratinize correctly and efficiently. And then that brings us up to the granulosum layer, and I think this is a really interesting layer of the skin, because a lot happens in the granulosum layer. In the granulosum layer, we are really seeing the cells now start to change and produce these granules. It's the point at which we have the production of keratin, and we're also getting that keratin being organized through something called filament aggregating protein, or also known as filaggrin. Now, that particular protein is really important all the way through the skin, but its first job in the granulosum is to make sure that we can create those tough corneocytes with our key effects of strengthening the cells. And then you've got your lamellar granules, which produce those lipids, which are really, really important in the intercellular space and help to reinforce that barrier. So don't forget, those lipids are pushed outside of the cell into the extracellular space, and when they get outside the space, they are processed and organized into lipid layers, which help to ensure that they create also an effective barrier. So at the granulosum layer, that brings us on to the calcium gradient, because the calcium gradient is super, super important in terms of regulating the processes that happen in that stratum granulosum layer. So if you look at my little diagram here, I'm going to draw a little section here. You can see that this section of the chart shows that we have a much higher density of calcium in the skin, and that high density of calcium is necessary for helping promote cell proliferation, cell differentiation, and the keratinization process. So in healthy skin, this calcium gradient needs to be much higher in the granulosum layer. And then as we move up towards the corneum, the calcium levels start to tail off. And that means that all those desmosome proteins can start to loosen up and the cells can start to detach. But there are lots of things that can change what happens with those levels of calcium. So actually, when your skin has a damaged barrier, so let's say, for example, you go out on a very, very cold, windy day, and your skin is very, very aggressed, and the surface barrier is very irritated or damaged from the environment, your skin will use calcium to help boost the barrier recovery. So what happens is the calcium within the cells migrates quickly to the exterior of the cells to raise the calcium gradient. And when that happens, it causes new cells to be born, and it causes differentiation and keratinization to take place. And then that means that we get our barrier starting to recover. There is suggestion that when you have a really oily skin, actually that can affect or alter the calcium gradient, because it essentially means that you have too much calcium in the upper layers in the stratum corneum. And so what that does is it accelerates the production of cells. So you get hyperproliferation of cells. And so there is a lot of conversation around high calcium levels being contributed to by an oilier skin. And as a consequence of that, you can find that those skins get more congested and more blocked because they're producing higher levels of cells and not being able to shed them as effectively. So let's click this off here with my little eraser, and let's move. Now, if you've got any questions about calcium gradient or anything that I've shared about those first sections of the skin, please pop them into the question and answer box. Oops, we're going the wrong way. Great. So that brings us up to the corneum. And as you know, the stratum corneum is defined as being biologically dead, but biochemically very, very active. So there's a lot that's happening in the corneum, even though we tend to refer to the cells as dead skin cells. The stratum corneum is divided into two key sections: our stratum compactum, which is the sort of denser section of the stratum corneum, and then the stratum disjunctum, which is the sort of 4 to 5 top cell layers that are already starting to detach and disconnect in preparation for desquamation. Now, the stratum corneum is interesting because we know that this is an area where we have to really, regulate. It helps us to regulate hydration, and it's important that we maintain a certain level of hydration in the skin. So we have lipids, which help with that to a degree, but they also help with the skin's sort of suppleness and flexibility. But within the cells, we also have those natural moisturizing factors. So earlier we spoke about filaggrin, and filaggrin is very, very concentrated in those stratum corneum cells. And that helps to hold a certain level of moisture in the cells, because without that moisture, the enzymes which promote desquamation inside the cells and start to help with the detaching process cannot actually function effectively. So it's really important that we have a good concentration of moisture and hydration in the skin. And we say that you need about 30% hydration in the skin in order for your skin water content to be sufficient for desquamation to happen and take place. The stratum corneum lipids we need to generate somewhere around 100 to 150 milligrams of lipids a day to make sure that those lipids are secure. So sometimes in some skins, we have to really up the ante in terms of what people are taking in internally, but equally hydrating moisturizers and nourishing moisturizers play a really important part in helping us to ensure that this actually is maintained, which is really, really important. That brings me on to talking about a very important aspect of the stratum corneum, and that is the area of pH. Because when we talk about pH in skin, we talk about it, quite a lot actually, to say, you mustn't use cleansers that don't have a pH that supports the skin's natural pH. But actually, it's becoming increasingly evident that pH is important, not just in terms of what's happening on the surface of the skin with our microbiome barrier. It's actually important through lots of different aspects of the skin. Now, they used to believe that the acidification of the skin was actually controlled by sebaceous activity. So I think probably historically you might have heard about the acid mantle, and the acid mantle was made up of sweat and sebum. But we now understand that actually acidification happens within the skin and within the stratum corneum and within, in fact, all the way through the skin, but particularly acidification changes at granulosum layer up towards the stratum corneum. Beneath the granulosum layer, your skin has the same pH as your body pH and your blood pH, which is around 7.2. But as you go above that tight junction barrier and you go above into the granulosum and up through the corneum, pH is really important, and acidification takes place through all of those cells. Now, when you're born, you don't have an acidic pH of your skin. It takes somewhere between 2 to 8 weeks for a baby's skin to acidify. And then as we get older, that acidity sort of maintains over, sort of really refines over the first year. And then from there, the baby skin starts to become slightly less responsive to everything around it, because it's now allowing a somewhat of an antibacterial activity. But it also means that the skin is developing better barrier function. So their skins are becoming less delicate as they get older, and they have much better structural integrity of the stratum corneum. So actually, what we now know is that as we get older, what happens is that we actually get an increase in our skin pH. So actually, our skin becomes less acidic as we get older. And one of the things that helps make our skin acidic is actually ceramides. So ceramides and ceramide processing in the skin makes our skin more acidic. So as you get older and your metabolic functions slow down and you're not producing as many ceramides and your skin's getting drier, your skin is also getting less acidic. And as a consequence, your skin is getting increasingly more vulnerable. And so it becomes very important as we get older to make sure that we're reinforcing that acidity in the skin. As you well know, acidity is equally important in terms of desquamation. So if we don't have the right pH of the skin, then we can have an alteration to how our skin desquamates. And actually, the enzymes function better or more efficiently the higher the pH of the skin. But once the skin pH starts becoming alkaline, basically what happens is those enzymes go out of control. And what would happen is that your skin's desquamation process would effectively go mad, and your skin integrity would be affected. And that's why skin can become peely, it can become vulnerable, and it can become extremely irritated. So a high pH, an alkaline or basic pH, is not great on the skin. And so in order to sort of regulate and control desquamation, we don't want it to be too low, because then the enzymes won't work at all. We have then essentially we're using other factors to basically detach the skin, but we want to control those desquamation enzymes and make sure that the skin integrity is maintained in a nice healthy balance. So that is probably all of the sciencey stuff that I wanted to talk to you about today. And so to sort of summarize some of the things that we were talking about, and then we can do some Q&A from everyone, is that, you know, I think it's really important for us in skincare to understand that the barrier condition is multifaceted. It's not just about lipids, putting in hydration and putting in oil. We need to think carefully about how we're balancing that microbiome layer. But we also, very importantly, need to think about pH. So yes, we need to maintain hydration, but equally we need to prioritize pH in everything that we're doing. So if you are doing a step in a professional service that changes or alters the pH of the skin, please make sure that you're putting it back to the right pH. If you're selecting a product that can help reinforce the pH, that's really important in helping to stabilize the skin. In fact, oats is known to help support acidity in the skin. So for those clients who have you know, very sensitive skins, actually what we notice is that there seems to be a shift and their skins are becoming less acidic. There's a lot of research around atopic dermatitis, for example. So stabilizing the acidity of the skin can have a big impact on helping to reinforce that barrier and help us to defend. And then sort of looping us back to earlier in the presentation where we were talking about pigment production and the importance of pigment production in terms of protecting us against ultraviolet. I think it's really important to remind everybody that actually in excessive exposure, the amount of pigment that we produce in our skin really isn't sufficient to protect us in the way we'd like it to. So SPF still remains a skincare priority for us. So I hope that some of the things we've covered today have been interesting, and that, you know, if you want to dig a bit more and really dissect those layers of the skin a little bit more, that you think about booking on the skin series. So there's a great skin series called How Your Skin Works, and that's a 3-hour session. It's really fantastic at spending a little bit more time in dissecting all the lipids in your skin and dissecting the natural moisturizing factors. But I wanted to just bring you today a little bit of a taste from slightly different perspectives that perhaps we don't talk as much about in our everyday conversations. So Beth, I think that we can probably switch out to some video. So I'm going to stop my screen, and then we can, great.
Awesome.
We can have a look at whether we got any questions from anyone.
Oh yes, we do. Yeah, we've got some really good questions. I think there's a lot of really great questions around the barrier formation you're talking about that first, specifically around the TJ. And there are a lot of people were like seeing the abbreviation. If you could kind of just maybe do a quick little recap on what that stands for and then how that actually works just quickly. And then we'll dive into some things, a lot about some pH, the flagrants. So I've got a few questions for you on that too.
Okay, perfect. So in that original picture, in fact, Beth, I'm going to pop my screen up because I think sometimes it's easier if I just go back to this slide for everybody. This one. So this here, the TJ barrier, that's your tight junction barrier. Okay, so SC is stratum corneum barrier, TJ is the tight junction barrier. So yes, the tight junction is probably pretty new information for a lot of us, because we don't tend to talk about it that much. But essentially, the tight junction is like the seal in our skin that prevents water from passing out, but also from water from flooding in and pathogens from getting in. So it's a bit like having a zip locker and actually completely sealing off that area. And the only way that things can pass through that tight junction is when there is changes to polarity. Okay. So it's a really sort of secure seal. That's the best way I can describe it in the skin.
Okay, and staying on barriers, someone said you had mentioned a little bit of information about the immunological barrier. Can you just quickly touch on that just one more time again?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we talk quite a lot in a lot of our workshops and classes about Langerhans cells. You know, Langerhans cells and various other types of macrophages do exist in the lower layers of the epidermis, and they can move. So they're effectively from your innate and humoral sort of immune systems. You also, as part of the immunological barrier, you also have cytokines. So these are kind of chemical messengers that are inflammatory mediators, pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory mediators that, you know, effectively allow another level of protection and defense, but it's an immune defense. So that's really important in terms of things getting into the body and creating infection.
Okay, excellent. Let's switch over to talking a bit about the calcium gradient. So I have some questions on here as well. Someone's asking, is there a possibility to affect the calcium gradient with skincare and or diet?
Yeah, so I mean, I think diet's a tricky one. I'm sure probably you can have shifts in calcium gradient if you're taking that in, but obviously we can't control how you're processing that or where that calcium might go or not go based on your body requirements. It's very difficult for us to say that you'll absolutely get a direct impact in your skin. However, with skincare, yes, absolutely, we can influence that. So there are lots of products which actually help either contribute calcium, and by contributing calcium, they actually help to strengthen and reinforce the integrity of the skin, because they help to elevate that calcium level in the stratum corneum. But also we have products that basically bind out calcium. So phytic acid is a good one that does that binds out calcium, and as a consequence, it helps to disconnect those desmosome junctions and helps to facilitate desquamation. So you can influence that through product, yes.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Staying on the calcium gradient, you had mentioned that the oilier skin can tend to have a higher calcium gradient. I thought that was a great explanation about leading that into like more of the congestion with increasing the overproliferation of dead skin cells. The question comes from, is there a reason why in particular oilier skin tends to have a higher calcium gradient?
I think the suggestion is that it's to do with the compounds of sebum. So basically what sebum is composed of, and because the sebum also sort of delays the exfoliation aspect, the calcium tends to build up and concentrate, and then as a consequence, as it's building and concentrating, you suddenly get this burst of hyperproliferation and more cells being produced, because the skin tries to get rid. So it tries to elevate the number of cells it's making to help improve desquamation. But the problem is that the oil and the sebum is actually inhibiting that to a point. So it's a little bit cyclical, unfortunately. And that's why sort of products that can help you to control or regulate the oil production are really important, and that works alongside potentially exfoliants, etc., that can then help stabilize and regulate that cell turnover so that it's all happening in a nice, even fashion.
Okay, which is what we want, right?
Yes.
We'd love to have that nice, even skin that
If only life was perfect.
Again, just a few more questions here. Someone wanted to check in just to have you repeat. You mentioned about it takes 2 to 8 weeks for a baby's skin to start becoming acidic.
Yes. Yes.
Then up to a year for the child's skin to regulate. Can you just verify that was a
yeah question? Yeah. So basically the initial acidification of the skin takes place in the first sort of 2 to 8 weeks. So normally, if you were having a baby, the midwife would probably tell you, don't wash them with all sorts of things in the first few weeks, you know, it's just water, or, you know, very, very mild, you know, sort of quite innocuous cleanses, because their skin is very vulnerable and they don't have that antibacterial benefit yet. But they also don't have the strength and integrity, because with acidification comes processing of the skin's natural barrier lipids, and as the lipids acidify, they also help to reinforce that corneum barrier. So the skin actually gets more effective or more efficient at the barrier job that it has to do. So baby skins are super vulnerable, but that vulnerability is still there. But by the time you get to about a year, that acidification process is secure, and that baby skin should be, you know, functioning as we would expect most children's skins to function.
Okay, awesome. Now, is there a way in the treatment room that you would recommend for someone's asking here to maybe test the pH on someone's skin, like during a consultation? I know we've done things where we've tested the pH of products before.
Yeah. I mean, there are universal papers, so you can, you know, wet an area of the skin and put a universal paper on. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to test people's skins. I mean, vaccinations, medications, all sorts of things can actually change the pH of your skin, health conditions. Also your environment, how oily your skin is. So, you know, people's skins can have a variation of pH, and in terms of ethnicity, actually, the darker your skin is, the more acid your skin is, because actually melanin, interestingly, also contributes to acidification of the skin. So the more melanin you have in your skin, the greater the acidification. So darker skins actually tend to be more acid naturally in nature. So, you know, there is variation across different skin types. But yes, I suppose you could use a universal paper and try it out.
Right. Okay. All right. Great. Back to kind of the beginning of your presentation today in regards to the filaggrin production.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we can do as therapists to, if there is a malfunction with filaggrin production? I know that's a
no. I think this is where it strays into, you know, medical treatment. So where you've got very faulty filaggrin production, you're going to start to see certain skin diseases developing. You know, atopic dermatitis is one that's probably high up the list there, and the reason that you have problems there is because you don't have the cells being well enough hydrated to allow effective desquamation, and it becomes very complex in sort of lots of different ways. So I think you have to be a little bit, you know, aware that there are certain things that we can change and control, but I think other things are going to be difficult. So if someone has a faulty gene or mutation that makes them predisposed to making faulty filaggrin, I'm not sure that that's somewhere we can go with skincare. We can certainly, if somebody's got slower cell turnover, that we can fix, Because if you're getting, slower, slowing down due to aging, then yes, of course, we can give it a bit of a kickstart and we can help trigger that process, but not if something's faulty from a genetic point of view.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I know there's a lot, like you said, getting into more of that medical side of it, and especially when it comes to like skin diseases and disorders as well. When it comes to a lot of questions, I'm kind of going through here as well. When it comes to understanding when we're using things like, back to pH, one, just kind of reminding everyone kind of like what is a healthy pH of the skin. So that's like the first part of the question. Second part is like, there's a lot of clients who use like retinol and a lot of salicylic acids on the skin. And if it's using a salicylic acid as an exfoliating mechanism, is that, changing the pH? Do we need to recommend to them to do something to make sure that their barrier stays healthy, it gets back to normal, if they're using a lot of those types of active ingredients in their home care?
Okay. Yeah, I probably should have said about pH in terms of what's a healthy pH for skin. So normally 4 to 6 on the pH scale is where we're aiming for. I think if you're using skincare products that lower the pH of the skin, what I would say is that most of the time when you're adjusting skin pH, whether you're just adjusting it up or you're adjusting it down, it takes around sort of 60 to 90 minutes for the pH to stabilize again. So your skin will endeavor to bring it back to where it needs it to be. Obviously, if you're doing that every single day, then for that period of time, that could have a compounded effect in terms of how happy or healthy your skin is. So for some skins that are using hydroxy acids or vitamins that have an acidic nature, some skins find that they become sensitive or irritated, because obviously there is an impact on changing that acidity and changing that sort of natural balance of the skin. So you can land up finding that those skins become a little bit more sensitive. So as a skin therapist, all you need to do is, balance out what's happening in their routine. So it might be that they just take a break for a bit, or it means that they need to buffer a little bit more, or they need to make sure that they add more hydration, because actually, if you add more hydration to the skin, hydration can help improve the acidity. So, so there are some strategies that you can do that there on that side. In terms of sort of going the other way, actually, because your skin becomes naturally more alkaline as you get older, and that pH changes and shifts away from that acidic bit. It's not, we're not saying that necessarily your skin's completely alkaline, but it moves closer to that neutral point.
Yeah.
And in that instance, that can make your skin feel quite dry. So I guess the lipids, natural lipids in your skin are affected. So the idea is that you should be bringing that back in line. And it made me think everyone about, you have people who say, I've washed my face with soap for my whole life and my skin has been fine. And what I would say to you is, it's never too late to change. And actually, your skin is changing as you get older, and your skin's becoming more and more dry and less and less acidic. So actually, using soap is compounding all of your issues of dryness, irritation, sensitivity, flakiness, tightness. So get off the soap. Even if you've been doing it for 50 years, get off the soap.
Yes. Do not use do not use that, right? No soap. Okay, perfect. Last two questions here, and then we're going to let you go. I know we're a few minutes over, but I mean, such a great time with you today. Back to, we're talking about delayed tanning right there with the information about the melanocytes and melanin. Can you kind of recap, what is delayed tanning and what that means in the skin as well? And then I think a spin-off of that question is, if you've got a client who's always like, I need to kind of do a pre-tanning, right? You hear this client's like saying that I need to get a little bit of sun, you know, so that I can stay out in the sun longer. I hear that before they go on vacation, which I think is interesting. So kind of recap delayed tanning, and how do we feel about pre-tanning?
Okay, so delayed tanning is actually where UVB is actually having a significant impact on your skin and is triggering your skin to now physically produce melanin. So the immediate tanning and persistent tanning, those tend to be darkening of the melanin that's existing in your skin. So it's your baseline color that's there at the moment being oxidized and darkened, so that your skin's endeavoring to filter a little bit more strongly. Okay, whereas a delayed tan is actually the real tan, if you like, where you actually produce more pigment in higher volumes, and you're distributing it at a faster rate through the cells, and that takes place over 2 or 3 days. So once it kicks in, it's a 2 or 3 day process, because your skin doesn't it can't make it in 2 minutes. So what it's doing with the delay, with the sort of immediate process, is trying to do something, while the delayed tanning is kind of catching up with that, because it's actually a big process that has to be set up to make more color beyond your baseline color. In terms of SPF, delayed tanning doesn't give you much more than a 3.
Okay.
So when it comes to pre-tanning, no, we don't do it. We don't do it. We're allergic to pre-tanning. We're not happy about that at all. It's, whether you're talking about going out in the sun and trying to get a bit of color, or whether you're talking about nuking yourself on a sunbed, which also fills me with abject horror, because I'm like, how far away is the sun?
Yeah,
billions of light years, but you're quite happy to light on a UV beam. I'm not sure about that at all. No. But ultimately, we're not in favor of pre-tan, because any tan is an indication that your skin is getting damaged.
Correct.
That's it.
Yeah.
So the minute your skin is making a change to color, whether that's immediate, whether that's delayed, that's an indication that your skin is under attack by UV and free radicals, and your skin is basically trying to defend itself.
Yeah. So
not good.
A deep tan is not a sign of healthy skin. It's your skin crying out for help.
Sorry for anybody out there who likes their pre-tanning mode, but no, you heard it here. No pre-tanning.
I think it's always interesting when you have those friends who tell you that they're going to go out, tanning, to a skin therapist. It's like, it's like walk of your life, right? So, well, awesome. Thank you so much. For everyone who've asked questions, if we haven't got to your questions today, I promise we're going to get onto this chat and be able to answer those for you, even after we log off with Candice, because I know it's the UK, it's headed into the evening for you, and you've got lots on your plate to take on. And we just want to thank you for spending.
Thank you for having me.
So we really appreciate it. And I know you had mentioned too that this is just a small bit about what's happening in the skin. We do have a skin series workshop. It's called How the Skin Works. If you're interested in that, 2 things to do. Go on to dermalinstitute.com. You can check out there's some US locations who are hosting that via IDI streaming. You can also just send an email to your local education team, and they'll be able to help sort that out for you as well. Everyone, Candice is like, loved it. Thank you. Brilliant. Amazing.
Oh, brilliant.
Such great info. And again, I just thank you for joining me and kicking off the industry expert.
Thank you for having me. I can talk for England. So it was a challenge, everyone, actually making sure that I got through it all. But thank you for joining us. And thank you for having me, Beth.
Yes, thanks a lot. Okay, everyone, stay tuned for next month. And that's going to be actually in August. So August 13th, That is going to be featuring Brooke Anderson, who is going to be one of our, again, leading educators in Canada, who's going to be talking all about acne. So we're just going to keep these topics coming and really be able to, bring you into the community and stay connected virtually with education that's impactful, empowering for everyone. So thanks again, Candice. It was great to have you here with us.
Bye-bye, everyone.